Okay, so we're going to move on now to perceived group variability or perceived group homogeneity. So like I said at the beginning, we're talking about the homogeneity between members of the same group, how similar they appear to one another. So this is based on a paper that I wrote with Constantina Badeau from France, and in this paper, it's a review paper basically, and in this paper we basically summed up a lot of the research that we conducted together looking at this particular area of perceived group variability, and you can see the title there, They're All the Same, which is talking about perceived group variability, but for several different reasons. So the review was basically pointing out that this perceived group variability effect, or perceived group homogeneity effect, can be driven by many different processes. And we picked out 4 of those, and those are what I'm going to be talking about now. But before we get into that, let me just give you a bit of a taste about the sort of effect that we are talking about. So there you've got the Queen's Royal Guard, and as you can see, they all look very similar to one another. And this is the sort of effect that I've been investigating, why people perceive members of certain groups to be relatively similar to one another, or in the technical term that we're using, perceived group variability. Now, of course, in this particular case, these people all look the same for a very obvious reason. Can you spot what that reason is? And the reason is because they're all wearing the same clothes, they're all standing in the same position, they're all holding the same kind of equipment, they're all doing the same thing. So it's an objective form of perceived group variability. They all look the same because objectively they all actually are the same. And I'll talk a bit more about that objective form of group homogeneity in a minute, but I also wanted to talk about some of the less obvious and perhaps more interesting from a social psychological point of view, more interesting subjective forms of perceived group variability. But first of all, let me explain a little bit about what this perceived group variability is and why it's important. So it's important for a number of reasons, basically. First of all, it reinforces stereotypes by leading people to generalize their stereotypical judgments from one group member to the rest of the group. So we would expect experiences with one group member to generalize more readily to other group members when the group is perceived to be relatively homogeneous. So if you consider Edward the Englishman being stereotyped as being reserved. You meet Edward the Englishman, you find out he's a very reserved kind of a character, and you also have the knowledge that all English people are very similar to one another. That would then lead you to predict that if Edward is very reserved and all English people are very similar to one another, then the rest of the English people are also very reserved. So perceived group variability is a way of spreading the stereotype. It enhances, reinforces the stereotype that's occurring there. The second issue here is that perceived group variability also, or perceived group homogeneity, so we've got to be careful about the terminology here, that we're talking about the similarity between members of the group, so it's not their differences, their variability, but really their similarity. And that homogeneity or similarity protects stereotypes by leading people to psychologically exclude non-stereotypical members from the group. So if you meet Elton John, for example, and he's waving his arms around and singing and dancing on tables and playing the piano loudly and being very flamboyant and so on, and not at all reserved, then suddenly you realise that not all English people are reserved. However, if you have a belief that English people are very similar to one another, then you might sort of subtype Elton John, put him in a subcategory of English people, because all English people are similar to one another and are very reserved. If you have that belief, then someone sticks out and doesn't fulfill that belief, instead of changing the whole stereotype and making you think, well, perhaps they're not all so reserved, you might hold on to that stereotype and just subtype poor Elton as some kind of a crazy English rock star. So perceived in-group variability, perceived in-group homogeneity, protects the stereotype and leads to a kind of a fencing off of counter-stereotypical group members. Also, perceived group variability is important because the homogeneity aspect can lead to prejudice and stereotyping. There's some recent research which has shown that perceived group homogeneity leads to discrimination, prejudice against other groups. And again, people are more likely to hold the same attitude towards a group of people when they perceive them to be all the same. If this attitude is negative, which is what prejudice and discrimination are, then it will be applied to group members more frequently when the group is perceived to be homogeneous. I don't like English people. English people are all the same. Therefore, I really don't like all of them, with no exceptions. Whereas if I perceive English people to be very heterogeneous, very variable, then I might say I don't like English people, but there are differences. There are some that I like and some that I don't like, some that I like more than others, because there is variability that I perceive between them. Whereas if they're all very homogeneous, then it's very easy for me to just hate them all, as it were. Fourth, people are likely to react more negatively towards deviant group members who belong to homogeneous groups rather than to heterogeneous groups, because homogeneous groups do not allow much room for deviance amongst their members. So if you belong to a homogeneous group, then you're going to get singled out as someone who is really, not towing the line, not conforming. It's going to be very difficult for you to express dissent, because as soon as you do something different from the rest, suddenly you look very different and you're going to be expelled from the group. Whereas if there's more variability in the group, then you're not so much of an odd person out, and you can feel free to say what you like. And finally, perceived group homogeneity, so this perceived similarity between group members, can reduce accuracy with which people recognise the faces of members of different groups. And this facial recognition deficit has been implicated in wrongful convictions based on inaccurate eyewitness testimony. Now, these are very blurry-faced creatures anyway, these men, but you can imagine, because they're all businessmen, they might be stereotyped as being members of a business person group, and so that might enhance the perceived similarity that you perceive between them, and that's therefore going to lead to inaccurate recognition of particular individuals within the group. So it's worth studying perceived group variability because it holds implications for our understanding of stereotyping, prejudice, and deviance, as well as catching criminals. So what I'm going to do in this part of the presentation is to discuss a program of research that Constantina and other colleagues have been engaged in with myself over the last 12 years. It's investigated why people perceive some groups to be more different, more variable than others. And this research, like I say, was published in the Current Directions in Psychological Science. In the review, we focus on four main reasons for why people might perceive members of groups to be more or less variable. And those four reasons are, number one, the perceiver's group affiliation. So are you a member of the group or are you not a member of the group? Are you in the in-group or not? And that can have an effect, as we'll see in a minute. Second of all, the group's objective variability. So are the group members actually, objectively, in reality, very similar to one another or not very similar to one another? We just looked at the Queen's Guard, and objectively they are very similar to one another. And obviously that objective reality can have an impact on our perceptions, and so we will perceive them to be very similar to one another. We're also going to look at the group's social position, and we're going to see how high social groups, they've got high social status, high power, larger groups tend to enjoy the perception of being more variable, whereas groups that are minority groups, low status groups, and groups that don't have all these high qualities tend to be perceived as being less distinct. So the group members are more homogeneous. They're all lumped together, if you like. And the fourth and final one is called group central tendency, which means basically where the group falls on any particular dimension. So it's the mean value. So if we have a dimension of reservedness, we have the English very up here in terms of their reservedness, very reserved, and the Australians down here in terms of their reservedness, then that's the central tendency of the group. In other words, they're the average English person and the average Australian person, where they fall on that dimension. And we're going to look at how those ratings, those mean ratings, those perceptions of where the group falls can itself have an impact on the perceived variability within the group. By saying that the group has more of a specific quality, people tend to perceive that group as being more homogeneous. So we'll look at why that is. So we'll start off first of all by looking at the perceiver's group affiliation. And this really is where the whole area came from. So back in the 1980s, the researchers here, Osterman, Sedikides, Linville and so on, they really discovered this effect, and they called it the outgroup homogeneity effect. And what it's all about is perceiving members of the outgroup to be more homogeneous than members of the in-group. So it really relies on you being a member of one of the two groups, and that you perceive your group, the in-group, to be more homogeneous. The members are more similar to one another than the members of the outgroup. I've just got that completely the wrong way around. Can I just say it for you again? And this is something you need to be careful about with this area. What people are actually perceiving is members of the in-group to be more heterogeneous than members of the outgroup. Because what we're seeing here is an outgroup homogeneity effect, that members of the outgroup are more similar to one another than members of the in-group. So here's you, hang on, in your in-group, and you see all your other members as being very different to one another, and then you look across the aisle and you see them, the others, whoever they are, and you see them as being very similar to one another. That outgroup homogeneity effect is the effect that triggered off this whole interest in perceived group variability, and it was an important starting point for the area, basically. Now, to confuse matters even more, after getting that wrong, I can tell you that, okay, we do have an outgroup homogeneity effect. This is the in-group, this is the out-group, but sometimes you get that. Sometimes you get an in-group homogeneity effect. So sometimes it is the case that you perceive members of your group to be all similar and the members of the out-group to be more different. It's all a relative effect, by the way. So it's not really about what's tied to reality. It's about whether or not they are more similar or different to each other compared to you. So you can get these two kinds of effects: in-group homogeneity effect and out-group homogeneity effect. And what is causing these effects? Well, in-group and out-group homogeneity effects are thought to be motivated by the need to maintain a positive, distinct social identity. So sometimes it's good to be part of a group of individuals, and sometimes it's good to be part of a group of team players. And that's what's causing it. Sometimes you want to be distinct, and sometimes you want to be in a group of, really similar people, because that will help you say, well, my group is good. So it's a really a context-based effect. Sometimes in the context that you're in, perhaps you're in a team player situation, and you want to show the other team that you are all very coordinated. In that context, you want your in-group to be very homogeneous. And other times, you're in a situation where homogeneity is frowned on and conformity is frowned on. And you want to show the other group that you are all free-ranging chickens who can basically do their own thing and be their own people. And it would be frowned on if you were all like clones and sheep who are just following the rest of the crowd. And so what you do is you show that really we're all individuals, and that helps to, ironically, boost your social identity. So in a way, you're being an individual in order to be a better group member. That's the argument there. So in some research, we've actually tried to look at when these in-group and out-group homogeneity effects occur. And we found that in a series of studies, we found that people only perceived their in-group to be heterogeneous, different from one another, when they made their variability ratings in relation to traits that were negatively stereotypical of the in-group or positively stereotypical of the out-group. Why? Well, if you think about it, both of those types of traits, both of those traits there are threatening to in-group members because they highlight the in-group's weaknesses, the negative stereotypical traits, and they highlight the out-group's strengths. Those are the positive out-group stereotypical traits. So, for example, as a man, I'd be likely to score high on the male negative traits of aggressive and arrogant than on the female positive traits of compassionate and sensitive. But by perceiving men as heterogeneous on those threatening traits, I can still call myself a man, but at the same time consider myself as an outlier in the group who's quite distinct from men's relatively negative position and closer to women's more positive position. Confused? You will be. No, confused? Let me try and explain with the beautiful Marilyn Monroe, who, as you can see here, herself had her own sort of out-group homogeneity effect going on. She said all the girl really wants is for one guy to prove to her that they are not all the same. So from her perspective, men were all very similar to one another, and women, by contrast, were different from one another. So let's consider Marilyn judging other men and other women, and let's see what kind of response she has here, what kind of perceptions she might have. So imagine Marilyn rating the variability of women and men on the trait adventurous. So at the one end of this dimension here, if you rate someone down here, then you're rating them as not at all adventurous. If you rate them up here, then they're extremely adventurous. And we've stereotypically given women the colour pink and men the colour blue, so we can see who's being rated where here. So adventurous. Well, adventurous is a positive stereotypical trait for men. It highlights a positivity that the in-group women do not possess in a stereotypical sense. So it's a threatening trait for women because it highlights a weakness. As you can see here, the average woman is not really regarded as being very adventurous, and the average man is being regarded as much more highly on this positive trait. So women see themselves as being, oh, well, I wish I could be more adventurous. I wish I could do better than that. So how might Marilyn perceive men and women on this particular trait then? Well, she might perceive men as being all the same. Here we've got a normal distributed curve with the most men being about this much of adventurous, a few men being quite extremely adventurous and a few men being not very much adventurous, but most of the men falling at the top level of the adventurousness scale here. And then you've got women. Now, Marilyn here has positioned herself up here as being fairly adventurous. Not as adventurous as most men, but nonetheless more adventurous than most women. So how does that affect her variability ratings of women? Well, it would produce then an out-group homogeneity effect, because by moving herself all the way up here and by continuing to categorize herself as a woman, she is effectively skewing the distribution of women and saying, well, yes, most women are not very adventurous, but some of them, in brackets, me, are very adventurous. And therefore we have a skewed distribution which produces an in-group heterogeneity effect and correspondingly an out-group homogeneity effect. And this is the pattern of results that our research demonstrated, that when we provided participants with these kinds of traits, we found that participants would perceive their group and other groups as being homogeneous or heterogeneous in a very strategic way, depending on what kind of traits we were asking them about. When we asked them about negative stereotypical traits of their group, suddenly their in-group became very heterogeneous. And we reasoned that that was because exactly this effect is going on, that people wanted to say, well, most of the people in my group are like that, apart from me, who's out here. And that obviously produces heterogeneity. And when correspondingly we asked them about particularly positive stereotypical traits, so for example, men rating themselves on the trait adventurous, then they'd say, well, we're all like that. We're very much similar, because there was no need for this odd person out to be in the group. So These results are important because they demonstrate that people may perceive their group to be more or less variable depending on whether they want to distance themselves from or associate themselves with their group's stereotype. So let's move on to the group's objective variability. So here we have two groups, and I'm assuming that you are going to relate more to this bunch of people than to this bunch of people. So let's assume, for the sake of argument, that most of you out there, this is your in-group and this bunch of weirdos is your out-group. What are you perceiving here in that case? You are perceiving then an out-group homogeneity effect because you are perceiving your group, normal people, to be more heterogeneous than the out-group, the others who are quite homogeneous in the way that they look. And why are you perceiving this to be the case? You're perceiving it to be the case because it is in actual fact, objectively and in reality, the truth. That these people, by their clothes, although a lot of them tend to be wearing sunglasses here, I've noticed, but by their clothes, by their demeanour, by the colour of their skin, etc., they are all heterogeneous compared to this group over here. So it brings us on to a second, less research, but more obvious reason for outgroup homogeneity. People may perceive the members of a group to be relatively homogeneous because they are, in reality, actually relatively homogeneous. And again, this is similar to the Queen's Guard effect that we looked at the start. The thing to note about this one is that unlike in-group and out-group effects, this is not a biased perception. It's not people trying to skew the group's distribution so that they can get closer to a more positive mean rating or anything like that. It's just people seeing things for the way they actually are. And it's perhaps because this accurate perception is quite straightforward that social psychologists have tended to ignore it, but just because it's not particularly interesting doesn't mean to say that it's not important. And so I've included it here as a key influence on perceived group variability, something to always bear in mind, that you may perceive groups to be more or less variable because they are actually more or less variable. Let's move on to that third point, which is the group's social position. So we're talking here about whether or not groups are small or large, low or high status, or low or high in power. And these social position effects may be due to the sort of objective differences in actual group variability that I just mentioned. So it may be that, in other words, that small groups are actually more homogeneous, or that high power groups are actually more heterogeneous because of real world factors causing those actual objective differences. It may also be due to cognitive effects that relate to differences in the salience of the groups that are involved. So small groups, low status groups, even low power groups in some cases, these tend to be the groups that we notice because they're unusual, they're out of the ordinary, they are, if you see a member of a minority group, that person sticks out. And so they become more salient to you. Because they become more salient to you, that can trigger these homogeneity effects to occur. Now, our own work in this area has shown that inferior groups are not always perceived to be more homogeneous than superior groups. In particular, we found that people rate group members as being significantly more similar to one another when the groups have won a competition compared to when they've lost a competition. So perceptions of group cohesiveness mediate or explain those results. So it seems like what's going on in that research is that people have an implicit understanding that uniformity, group cohesiveness and coordination are necessary for successful group performance during intergroup competitions. So winning a competition might actually make you seem more homogeneous, because if you're a bunch of disorganized people who, all over the place and totally out of sync with one another, then it's unlikely you're going to be able to pull yourselves together enough to win a competition. So by winning a competition, most people will rate the winners as being more homogeneous because they'll assume that they couldn't have won unless they got their act together. So this is really a caveat. Our research shows a caveat to what's gone before here, this previous research, because it shows that yes, groups with inferior social positions do tend to be perceived as relatively homogeneous, apart from the exception of when we're talking about competitions, when the reverse seems to occur. So again, there's no we come out with these statements saying this happens when this happens, but really there are always caveats, and it depends on the context. And that's like a golden rule when we're considering these kind of social effects. Now, the final effect here is the group's central tendency. And like I was saying before, that really talks about where you perceive the average group member to be on a certain dimension. And previous research has shown that people rate groups as being more homogeneous on stereotypical dimensions where the group's central tendency is high. So, for example, I might rate men as being more homogeneous than women when I rate the two groups on the dimension adventurous, because men's central tendency is higher on that trait. So we have an effect there, and what is confusing is we're not sure exactly why it is. Why do people rate group members as being all very similar to one another on traits that they possess? That's the question. Previous researchers have explained this effect in terms of perceivers' group affiliations. So people rate in-groups as being relatively homogeneous on stereotypical traits in order to protect the positive social identity that's associated with the in-group. And this sort of relates back to what I was talking about at the beginning, which is that the whole area of perceived group variability stemmed from people stumbling onto this effect whereby people tended to see the in-group as more heterogeneous and the out-group as more homogeneous, right? And that's where we started off. And so researchers, as they carried on researching this area, always tried to relate it back to in-groups and out-groups. And that's what's happened here. We find that groups tended to be rated as more homogeneous on traits that they possess than on traits that they don't possess. And the researchers such as Simon said, well, probably that's because people are rating their own groups and not other groups. So it may be an in-group, out-group effect. Now, we came along and said, well, maybe that's true, but maybe it's not. And we provided an alternative explanation where we assumed that people often follow what we called a homogeneity equals trait possession heuristic. Complicated sounding stuff, in which homogeneous groups are perceived to possess traits more than heterogeneous groups. So we just basically said, what if people, when they're making these strange ratings of homogeneity, when they're asked how similar do you find people within the group, what if people, when they haven't got much to go on, what if they are just saying homogeneity means that I think that they possess the trait, and heterogeneity means that I think that they don't possess the trait. So what if they were using their homogeneity and heterogeneity ratings sort of symbolically in order to try to explain to the researchers what they thought? So based on that assumption, we hypothesized that people rate groups as relatively homogeneous on stereotypical traits in order to indicate their perception that the groups possess those traits. So, for example, Marilyn Monroe would rate men as being particularly homogeneous on the trait adventurous because she believes that men possess that trait to a greater degree than women. So our explanation assumes that people's ratings of group variability symbolize their perception of the extent to which groups possess traits. This symbolic variability explanation is distinct from the social identity explanation, the in-group, out-group explanation I was talking about, because it doesn't relate to the perceiver's group affiliation or the need for a positively distinct social identity. Consequently, it can explain the stereotype effect regardless of the affiliation of the perceiver and the valence of the traits concerned. So, our symbolic variability explanation assumes that people use their ratings of group variability symbolically because they do not have a more direct method of expressing the group's central tendency to the researchers. And consistent with that assumption, we found that people who indicated a group's trait possession using an explicit method no longer rated the trait as relatively homogeneous on stereotypical traits. So what we did is we basically said, look, if people are giving us these homogeneity ratings as a way of telling us which group possesses traits and which group doesn't, then maybe we can shortcut that if we up front allow people to tell us straight away which group possesses traits and which group doesn't. Because once people have told us that, they will have no reason to tell us it again using the variability ratings. So that's what we did in an experiment. We had two conditions, and we said to the people in one condition, rate people in terms of their variability on these traits. And in another condition, we told them to rate people on their variability on these traits. But before they did that, we asked them, can you just tell us how much each group possesses the traits? And in this second condition, when people had the opportunity to tell us how much each group possessed the traits, we no longer found that homogeneity was being used, was varying as a function of trait type. So for example, if I ask you, how adventurous do you think men are? And you tell me very adventurous. And then I say to you, right, well, how variable do you think they are then compared to women? Then we wouldn't find that you would tell us that they were particularly variable or particularly non-variable. In other words, any effect of traits on your perceptions of variability would disappear if you'd originally told us about how much the groups possess the traits. And the reason for that is because by telling us how much you believe that the groups possess the traits, you've done your job. Why waste time telling us the information again and again? It's sort of out of your system, if you like, and so there's no need to keep telling us using this other method of variability. I hope I've explained that to you, okay? Anyway, so moving on. This is a little bit of a fancy diagram we stuck at the end of our article. We called it a model. Really, it's just a summary of some multiple influences. And the main point and the main takeaway from all of this, if you don't get any of the explanations I've been giving you, is to understand that perceived group variability in the past has been thought about as being to do with in-groups and out-groups. And that is one of the main reasons for these effects happening. So yes, perceived as group affiliation will provide strategic motivation for you to have in-group and out-group homogeneity effects, and that will lead to perceived group variability. But it's only one of three or more potential reasons here. So the group's objective variability, whether or not you're just a normal person or a member of the Queen's Guards, will influence your perceived group variability. And by the way, people also do over or underestimate actual variability, so that's something we need to be aware of as well. Also, the group's social position we talked about, whether or not you belong to a group that's high or low status, has a lot of power or very little power, has a good social position or not a good social position, is a majority or a minority group. All of those things, depending on social context, can create position-based homogeneity effects. Social context, like I've been saying, is important because in some cases, being a winner might be good for you and therefore produce homogeneity effects. And in other cases, being a very powerful person, but being a member of a powerful group may actually produce a heterogeneity effect. And finally, we had this sort of weirder one, which I hope I explained adequately, which is basically this idea that people they have a need to express the group's central tendency, and they might use variability ratings symbolically. If they aren't able to directly tell the researchers, look, this group possesses this trait and this group doesn't. If we don't give people the opportunity to express that through mean ratings or any kind of Likert scale, and we just simply present them with the variability ratings, then they might use the variability ratings to tell us which group possesses traits and which groups don't. I think that's the most simplest way I can explain it. Here are the flying elvi, and this is an example of outgroup homogeneity, unless you look like that. And they are a 10-man skydiving team of Elvis impersonators who are based in Las Vegas. I'm assured that elvi is the plural of Elvis. So there's an example of outgroup homogeneity for Hello again. I just wanted to let you know about a research website that is available, which provides more information about my research. I talk about not only the things that I've talked about today, but also other research projects that are going on and have been completed. So I do a lot of stuff about social class as well. And you can also find out about how to apply for a PhD and how to apply for scholarships if you would like to join me in investigating the sorts of things that I've talked about today. So please feel welcome. I'll get rid of my face and you can have a look at the link there. You can freeze the frame and copy that down and go and visit that website and find out more about me and my work. Thank you very much.